Chapter 3, Holden starts out with a great line. "I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life." So Holden hates phonies, but he has no trouble, apparently, lying through his teeth to the people around him. Is that phony? Holden talks about this guy named Ossenberger, who was a Pensy graduate, and we know how Holden feels about the Pensy guys. He's a Pensy graduate who goes on to become an undertaker. That's a business, an undertaker, right? An undertaker is a person who's responsible for funeral parlors and handling of dead bodies. Somebody's got to do it. Holden doesn't like this guy, calls him a phony, of course, but it does suggest that even death, which is a big part of life, and something that Holden has a really hard time accepting, and we'll get more on that later, even death is something that can be commercialized. Somebody dies, an undertaker can make a buck. Now some might argue, my goodness, that's terrible. On the other hand, if you didn't have undertakers, the world would be piling up with dead bodies. And I think that would be worse. So this ties back to Holden's earlier comment about prostitutes, that even death itself gets prostituted, right, in American culture. Most American literature, in some way or another, critiques American culture. Catcher in the Rye definitely does that. Holden is very critical of American culture. Now, Holden remembers one thing about this guy Ossenberger's visit to Pensy. Ossenberger's a bigwig. There's a wing named after him because he donated so much money to Pensy Prep. But as he's making a speech talking about, it's supposed to be inspirational to the students and how they could all become successful, a guy sitting in front of Holden farts. And they're sitting in a chapel. It's literally a fart in church. Holden seems to be one of the few people that finds this funny. Does this suggest that Holden is immature? Or that Holden is able to take something which is supposed to be, sort of sacred, church, a successful guy making a speech, and sort of shoots it down because he's not into all that David Copperfield kind of crap. In other words, he's anti-establishment. We also learn in this chapter that Holden, when he was in New York City losing the fencing equipment, bought his red hunting hat. This is an iconic symbol. It's, kind of sums up Holden Caulfield. Another great character who's anti-establishment is from another fantastic book, A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. And the guy in that book is older, he's 30, and he's nothing like Holden physically. He's this huge overweight guy, and he's very arrogant and very, which I suppose Holden is too. But he wears a green hunting hat, something to be noticed. Holden talks about his red hunting cap. Not only would it be kind of a funny sort of thing to do, because in those days the boys were all wearing shirts and ties, so he'd have this on, this shirt and tie plus a red hunting hat. He also wore it flipped around backwards. Nowadays it's common to see people wearing hats like this, but you will more frequently see them wearing them like this, over here, up this way. But in the 40s, it was a lot more conservative. The only reason anybody ever wore a hat backwards was if you were a baseball catcher and you needed to fit your face mask onto your face and get the brim out of the way. Holden's in his room trying to read a book, and the titles he mentions shows that he reads some what we would today consider to be pretty advanced literature. Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy, Out of Africa. These are all books that are frequently taught in schools. Holden is reading them for pleasure. And yet, he calls himself quite illiterate. Is there a lack of self-awareness there? Is he speaking ironically? Again, these are questions that you should answer. In walks his next-door neighbor, Ackley, that Holden finds incredibly annoying. He's also got a lot of pimples. Some people have suggested that Ackley should remind the reader of acne. Now, the interesting thing here is we know that Holden appreciates or wants to appreciate the details in people. And he gets mad when other people don't appreciate those kinds of details. And yet, for all of his appreciation of Ackley's details, ultimately he reduces him to what he calls a guy like Ackley. And when you say a guy like Ackley, you've taken an individual and you've made him into a stereotype. Because you're not talking about the person now, you're talking about a sort of hypothetical guy like that person. They start talking about Holden's red hunting hat. Ackley says where he comes from, that would be a deer shooting hat. And Holden says a line that's sort of become famous. I shoot people in this hat. In the 21st century, with the gun violence that goes on every day in this country, and where you hear in the news about gun violence at schools and stuff, a line like I shoot people in this hat takes on a pretty big connotation. In fact, Mark David Chapman, the assassin who killed John Lennon, says that he was highly influenced by Catcher in the Rye. In fact, he was when they caught him, he had a copy of Catcher in the Rye on him. It's another thing you could look up. Point is, Holden, he's not a violent guy, so I don't think he literally means he shoots people in this hat. But what he does is character assassination. He shoots at their personalities because he's ultimately very dissatisfied with just about everybody he meets. One thing in this chapter that Holden and Ackley seem to agree on is their roommate Stradlater. Neither one can stand him. They both find him to be sort of full of himself and arrogant. And the whole time Holden is talking with Ackley, Ackley's cutting his nails and dropping the nail trimmings, and it's driving Holden absolutely crazy because, well, it's gross. But at this point in the story, where Holden is talking about Stradlater to Ackley, Holden actually defends him and says, well, you got to get to know him a little bit better. If you like the tie that Stradlater was wearing, Stradlater would literally give it to you, right? Like the expression, he'd give you the shirt off his back, only in this case, he'd give you the tie off his neck. Holden is able to recognize that somebody who he does find annoying, and we'll get to that shortly, still has redeeming qualities. He wants other people to recognize that, but in his mind, nobody ever does. And we'll get to the next part of the story soon. Until then, salud.